Welcome back to Essentia Foundation's Analytic Idealism course. Last time, in part 3, we covered constitutive panpsychism. We've discussed the fact that panpsychism seems to be motivated on a fallacious logical bridge, on the notion that the structure of the world perceived should also be the structure of the perceiver, of the subject of perception. Now, this logical bridge is arbitrary, so panpsychism is sort of motivated by an arbitrary bridge. We've also discussed why panpsychism entails an insoluble problem comparable to the hard problem of consciousness, namely the subject combination problem. There is no coherent and explicit account under panpsychism, under constitutive panpsychism, for how ostensive fields of subjectivity, which are supposed to be fundamentally separate and distinct, can somehow combine into a higher order, unitary seeming field of subjectivity. In other words, how the ostensive little consciousnesses of the subatomic particles constituting my brain can combine to make up my unitary consciousness, my unitary conscious inner life. There is no account of that, and there probably cannot be already in principle any account of that, because it's arguably incoherent. And finally, we've seen that constitutive panpsychism is physically incoherent, insofar as it depends on the notion that elementary subatomic particles, which are supposed to be conscious, are themselves little bodies with discrete, definite boundaries in space. We've seen that what we call elementary subatomic particles are simply patterns of excitation of a spatially unbound quantum field. Therefore, panpsychism fails to account for separate minds. And that is sort of the final straw to discard panpsychism. So now we've covered 3 modules, parts 1, 2, and 3, and in each one of them we've sort of destroyed a common idea or a common intuition in our culture today. In part 1, we've argued for the incoherence of our regular, ordinary intuitions about the nature of the world. In part 2, we've done the same for mainstream physicalism, and in part 3, for constitutive panpsychism. So it has been sort of a journey of destruction so far. So it's time for us to take a turn and offer some construction, offer some coherent alternative that is not only coherent, but internally, logically consistent, empirically adequate, conceptually parsimonious, and explanatorily powerful. An option that holds up to scrutiny. And that's what this part 4 is about. It's the part that gives the name to the course, Analytic Idealism, which I will argue is not only a superior hypothesis. I think it is the only tenable hypothesis on the table today. So, enough of that. Let's get right to it. To begin with, let's first acknowledge, and I did that at the end of the previous part, let's acknowledge some basic observations about reality. Number 1, we do seem to share the same world. We seem to inhabit a common world. Why? Because if you were to be sitting here next to me in my study, you would describe my study in a way very consistent with my own description of it. We all seem to agree that we live in a world where there is gravity, where there are trees, other people, cars, buildings, stars in the night sky, and so on. So whatever this shared world may actually be, however misleading our ordinary intuitions of it may be, there is a shared world. There is something that can play the role of a shared world. I think that is an undeniable empirical observation. Number 2, we can't change the world simply by wishing it to be different. I realize I made an error in the numbering here. Bear with me. Look, if we could change the world like we can change the course of our daydreaming by simply imagining imagining it to be different, the world would be different right now because I wish it to be different. I would eliminate many of the problems that I see around the world today simply by wishing them away and replacing them with something more positive and more harmonious. But I can't do that, and presumably neither can you. So whatever this world is, it is not acquiescent to our inner volition, to our whims, desires, and fears. It is whatever it is, independently of us. It does what it does, regardless of whether we like it or not. And the third fact, number 2 in the slide, inner experience correlates with brain function. It would be naive to deny this, and you don't even need to be a sophisticated neuroscience and get into the neural correlates of consciousness as studied through brain imaging and functional MRIs and all that. Regular experience shows us that, if you drink alcohol, that will somehow impact your brain function. We know that physiologically that happens, and that comes hand in hand with a change in how you feel in your inner experience. Or if you get punched in the face, that alteration of your physiological or metabolical brain function, or even anatomical brain function, can lead to vastly different inner experience. So whatever theory of reality we put forward, it cannot contradict any one of these facts, because these are sort of theory-independent observations of the world and our role within it. So whatever theory of reality we come up with not only cannot contradict them, hopefully it should make sense of them, should explain these 3 observations. Otherwise, it's a theory of reality without sufficient explanatory power. Now, before we get to the meat of it, let's take one step back and remind ourselves that matter, what we call matter as conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism, namely that which can be exhaustively defined by a list of numbers that is purely quantitative and has nothing inherently qualitative to it, that conceptual notion of matter is a theoretical abstraction meant to try and explain the 3 observations of the previous slide, meant to try and make sense of these things that we just discussed. Matter, in the way it is conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism, is not itself an empirical observation. It is a theoretical abstraction based on empirical observations. And physics, if you take this into account and you sort of, okay, I acknowledge that matter is a sort of philosophical theoretical entity, that physics shouldn't be dependent on it, then what is physics about, fundamentally? Before we bring in metaphysical theory into physics, what is physics in and of itself? Well, physicists who are a little bit more thoughtful about philosophy make no mistake in explaining what this is. I mean, this is a quote from Stanford physicist Andrei Linde, who is very well known and respected for his theory of cosmological inflation. He put it in very simple and accurate terms. He said, let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions. I know for sure that my pain exists, my green exists, and my sweet exists. Everything else is a theory. Later, we find out that our perceptions obey some laws which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions. In other words, matter, for instance. This model of material world obeying laws of physics is so successful in practice that soon we forget about our starting point and say that matter is the only reality. You see, we replace the reality of perception with a theoretical abstraction called matter. And we forget that we are doing this, that we are making this move. We forget that it all starts from perception, and that physics ultimately is a science of perception. Physics is the science that studies, models, and predicts the behavior of the dials in our dashboard, if you recall from part 1 of this course. Indeed, as we've seen back then in part 1, what we call the physical world the world with spatiotemporal extension of discrete objects moving and doing whatever they do, and fields and all that. That world is actually a dashboard of dials that evolution has equipped us with so we can survive in face of the pressures of natural selection, and so that the variability or the variance of our inner states is kept. So our inner perceptual states does not have so much variation that we would dissolve into an entropic soup. So instead of giving us a transparent window into the world as it is in itself, we are equipped with a dashboard of dials that caps our internal entropy as arising from perception. It caps the variability of our internal states. We've seen all this in part 1. So if that's what the physical world is, the dynamics of the dials on the dashboard, then what physics studies is the behavior of the dials, how the needles move with respect to one another. Maybe this needle is moving this way, and every time it moves this way, that needle moves the other way. And then we can write some mathematical equations relating the behavior of this needle here underneath to the behavior of that needle here on the top. This is physics. Physics studies, models, and predicts the behavior of the dials on the dashboard, which is what we call the physical world as displayed on the screen of perception. Therefore, physics is a science of perception, or to say the same thing in different words, it's a science of the dashboard, of the dials on the dashboard, the behavior of the dials. Now, why I'm saying this as introduction? Because we have to guard against something that is damaging to philosophy and damaging to physics, which is to expect that physics will provide all the answers about what the world is in and of itself. It's too much to expect from physics. It will fail, and this will be a disservice to physics. And it's also a disservice to philosophy that tries to do precisely that, as opposed to physics. Because one, physics, and all science for that matter, all of science, studies the behavior of nature, not what nature is. Why? Because that's what experiments can tell us. Experiments can tell us how nature behaves given a certain set of conditions. It doesn't tell us directly what nature is. Now, of course, knowing how nature behaves can inform our educated speculations about what nature might be. And some hypotheses about what nature might be contradict nature's behavior as observed through science. In that case, those hypotheses are simply wrong and should be discarded. But science does not settle questions of being. It only informs an attempt to answer those questions. What science settles are questions of behavior. And that's all we need to develop technology and improve our lives. You know, if science helps us to play the game of life better, it needs to tell us how the game behaves, not what the game is. You know, a 5-year-old kid can play a computer game and be a world champion because the kid knows how the game behaves. The kid knows that if he goes through that door, he will die. The character will die. Or if crosses that bridge, he will score points. That's the game's behavior, equivalent to nature's behavior. But the kid has no idea about the underlying hardware and software and all the computer science involved in constructing the game. The kid doesn't know what the game is. But the kid can become a world champion playing the game simply through knowing how the game behaves. Science plays this role, but I'm not trying to compare science to a kid. There is a sense in which it is compared to philosophy. But science is extremely important and useful simply by looking at how nature behaves, because that's how we develop technology and try to win the game of life. But we cannot expect from it that it would settle questions of being, questions about what nature is in and of itself. Moreover, even the behavior that physics, in this case more particularly, that physics studies is the behavior of the dashboard, which of course correlates with the behavior of the world out there as it is in itself. But there is a step of indirection here. Physics cannot observe the world as it is in itself. It only has access to perception. Even if we use instrumentation, we only see the output of that instrumentation on the screen of our perception. Even if we are using, X-rays and particle accelerators and LiDARs and radars and whatnot, it is the output of all those instruments that we need to perceive in order to make something of it. So physics only has access to the dashboard, to the screen of perception. And by studying the regularities with which the needles in the dashboard behave, studying and modeling those regularities through mathematical equations and quantities, it can give us a hint about how the world as it is in itself behaves, because again, the dials are correlated with the world. The dials represent our measurements, our observations of the world. So there is a usefulness in that, but there is also a step of indirection. Physics is a science of perception, of the dashboard, not a science of the world as it is in itself. So this is all disclaimers. Let's now get to the actual substance of this module. Now, we've seen that matter is a theoretical abstraction. It's an explanatory abstraction that tries to make sense of those three facts that we saw in the very beginning, these three undeniable observations. So matter is a theoretical abstraction to try to make sense of these observations. But matter itself is not a given. It is not an empirically observable thing without question begging. It is observable if you beg the question. If you say, well, I can observe this bottle top, therefore matter is observable. Well, only if you theoretically assume that this perception here, what you see, corresponds to matter as conceptually defined under mainstream materialism. But that is assuming the answer to the question, not answering the question. So matter without question begging is not an empirical given. It is a theoretical abstraction, which then raises the question, what are the empirical givens? So let's start from those. Let's take this theoretical step back, because physicalism has led us nowhere. We need to find another direction. And to do that, we have to trace our steps back from all the way to the point before we made those incorrect assumptions that underlie mainstream physicalism, and try to go about it in a different way. That's what this slide's trying to do. It's trying to start from solid ground, not from theoretical assumptions that we have inherited from previous generations, rather uncritically. So what is safe to say? It is safe to say that there is experience. That's nature's given. Before we start theorizing, we experience. If we did not have any experience, there would be exactly nothing as far as we are concerned. Since we are here talking about, there is something, therefore there is experience. And then, per force, there is an experiencer. There is the subject of experience. Now, throughout this module, try to pay attention not only to what I'm saying, but also to what I am not saying. Because through experience, I know that people have a natural tendency or disposition to project their own assumptions and expectations onto what I am saying, and therefore to read in my words more than what I'm actually saying. So I am not saying that this experiencer is a person or an animal or an individual material entity or pure information. I'm not saying what it is. I'm just saying that because there is experience, then per force there is an experiencer, whatever it is, wherever its boundaries may or may not lie, whatever its intrinsic nature may or may not be, there is an experiencer, because there is no sense in talking of experience without a subject of experience. As Galen Strawson likes to say, not even a sensible Buddhist would deny this. A Buddhist would deny the reality of an individual self. But I'm not saying that the experiencer here is an individual self. So the Buddhist denial does not deny that experience requires an experiencer. Even the way we understand the word in language, experience, requires the existence of an experiencer. It is literally meaningless to talk of experience without some form of experiencer, some form of that to which the experience is given. Now, second, solid conclusion we may extract. Whatever else it may be, brain function is a perceptual experience. If brain function had never been perceived by someone, we wouldn't be talking of a brain function. The neuroscientist perceives the output of a functional MRI. The psychiatrist perceives the traces that are produced by an EEG or an MEG. So every time, or the neurosurgeon perceives the dilation of the brain capillaries as he's doing brain surgery, which correlate with brain activity. So whatever else it may or may not be, what we call brain function is certainly a perceptual experience. Somebody perceives something that they call brain function. Now, it's also safe to say that the brain is made of what we call matter. Now, by using the word matter here, I'm using it in a colloquial sense. There is this thing we call matter. For instance, this bottle top here is made of matter. By acknowledging this, I am not acknowledging that matter, as conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism, exists. I don't think it exists at all. But using the word matter colloquially only refers to the contents of perceptual experience that we are culturally trained to call matter, colloquially. So from this point on, every time you see me using the word matter, I will be using it colloquially, because it's just silly to deny the existence of that which we ordinarily and colloquially call matter. In other words, the contents of perception. So matter exists as that, but it doesn't exist as conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism, as we've discussed in part 2. So under this colloquial sense, the brain's made of matter, the same types of atoms and force fields that constitute the rest of the universe. So whatever we call matter is or isn't, whatever it is, it underlies both the brain and the rest of the universe, whatever what we call matter is. So there is this kinship between what we call a brain and the rest of the universe. Both seem to be made of the same underlying stuff that we colloquially call matter, whatever the strict philosophical definition of that term might be. Right, so these are three solid facts. They are not theory-laden. They are not based on hidden assumptions. They are not based on question begging. They are solid and theory neutral, so to say, metaphysics neutral. We can have high confidence in these three facts and the three observations that we started to begin with. Those were observations. These are not really observations. These are already theoretical conclusions, but theoretical conclusions that are solid and safe and not dependent on a particular metaphysical point of view. So far this is all solid ground. Now the question is, how do we interpret these solid facts, this solid ground, in the simplest possible way? That's what this slide is about. Here's my proposal. To begin with, we have to avoid any fundamental ontological distinction between experience and experiencer. Why? Because if we made an ontological distinction between the two, we would run into all kinds of problems. Namely, how can the experience relate to the experiencer? How does the experiencer feel the experience if the two are completely separate and distinct ontologically? So you get into the interaction problem, for instance, of substance dualism and a number of other problems, not the least of which is parsimony. So to avoid this, we are going to say that an experience is an excitation of the experiencer. In the same way that ripples are an excitation of water, or that a dance, a choreography, is an excitation of the dancer. There is nothing to the dance but the dancer in movement, in excitation. There is nothing to ripples but the water in which they ripple. There is nothing to ripples but water in movement, in excitation. In exactly the same way, my proposal is there is nothing to the experience but an excitation of the experiencer. So the only thing that has standalone existence is the experiencer. Experience can be reduced to the experiencer. Or, in other words, experience can be explained in terms of the excitations of the experiencer. So we avoid any ontological distinction between the two. And this is a very handy starting point. Try not to judge this story yet. I'm trying to give you a complete story first, and then we can get critical about whether this story is really the best one. Right now, I just want you to follow my line of reasoning mildly critically, but not too critically at this point. The time will come for you to be really critical. Number two, there are two experiential perspectives. This derives directly from our observation that brain function and inner experience are tightly correlated. And it also derives from our theoretical understanding that whatever else brain function might be, it is too also an experience. Because a brain scientist needs to see the output of a brain scanner to talk about brain function, for instance. So both are experiences that correlate with one another, brain function and first-person inner experience. So we can say that there are two experiential perspectives. One is the extrinsic brain function. The other is the intrinsic inner life. Both are experiences. My inner life is my experience. My brain function is an experience of the neuroscientist studying my brain, but both are experiences. So now how do we account for these two experiential perspectives? How do we account for their correlation? I propose that the simplest, least committal way to account for them is the following. The extrinsic perspective is the appearance of the intrinsic perspective from a certain point of view. In other words, brain function is what my conscious inner life looks like when it's observed by a brain scientist through a brain scanner. I'm not saying that brain function generates my conscious inner life. That leads to much more complication. It leads into the hard problem of consciousness. It's a much more committal step to take. I'm just saying that brain function is what inner experience looks like when observed from a certain perspective, namely a second or third person perspective. This is the least committal, simplest interpretation of these solid empirical facts that we've listed before. Okay, next step. I want to argue that, as we've seen, there is an experiencer. I want to argue that there is only one experiencer. And why do I want to do that? It's because it would make things a lot easier. It would give us a much more promising path towards an explanation for the facts of life in existence than otherwise. Because if there are multiple fundamentally distinct experiencers, we run into all kinds of problems again, like why would nature be such that fundamentally distinct experiencers just pop? And how do they interact if they are fundamentally and ontologically distinct? Again, the interaction problem. So it would be nice if there were a way to make sense of reality by postulating only one experiencer and then finding a way to explain how seemingly distinct minds, how seemingly distinct subjects of experience arise from this one fundamental experiencer. That's the motivation for what I'm saying in this slide. Now, as we've seen, we know that whatever matter is, whatever that thing we call matter is, the brain is made of it, and so is the rest of the universe. So there is this kinship. Now, if the matter that constitutes my brain is simply the extrinsic appearance of my conscious inner states, in other words, if the matter in my brain is what my conscious inner states look like when observed from the outside, then the same should apply to the universe as a whole. All matter in the universe should be the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life, because otherwise we would be postulating an arbitrary discontinuity in nature. If the matter in my brain is an appearance of conscious inner states, why would the same matter, when it's not in my brain, but it's constituting stars and galaxies, why would it be something fundamentally different? Therefore, the implication of this idea is that the universe as a whole is also the appearance of universal conscious inner life, of transpersonal mental states that underlie all nature. Now, if that is so, and the matter in my brain, which is the appearance of my conscious inner life, organizes itself in a certain topological structure, we would expect to see a sort of fractal similarity with the topological structure of the universe as a whole at its largest scales, because again, both are appearances of inner conscious states, underlying conscious states. Now, is that the case? As it turns out, it is the case. This is a picture of a simulation of the topology of the universe, the network topology of the universe at its largest scales. And this is a picture of a mouse's brain. And they are similar. Now, I will grant to you that we can make any two images look very much like each other if we just crop them right, use the right color map, the right saturation, and all that, and the white balancing, the right rotations. So we shouldn't trust the images alone. The question is there more to the similarity than just these images? And sure enough, there is. There are, again, independent but converging lines of research leading to the conclusion that at a quantitative level, when we quantize through the tools of information, when you quantify through the tools of information theory the network structure of the universe and the network structure of neuronal networks, they are uncannily similar. And we know of no reason why they should be so similar. That physics provides us with absolutely no reason, or biology, with no reason whatsoever to expect this similarity, this uncanny similarity. So this is not just images that look alike. This is the quantified application of information theory to both network structures, leading to uncannily similar results, which, by the way, is what you would expect under the premises of analytic idealism. If matter, if everything that is displayed on the screen of perception is simply how inner conscious life presents itself to observation, in other words, how mental states that constitute the world outside as it is in itself, how they present themselves in the dials of our dashboard of dials, if that's what matter is, then it's no surprise that the universe as a whole should have some degree of similarity with living nervous systems, because both are images of inner mental processes, underlying mental processes, as displayed on the dashboard of dials that we call the physical world. Now, there is a paper recently published in November of 2020 by the same authors that you saw in the previous slide, Franco Vatsa and Alberto Feletti. One is a cosmologist, the other one is a neuroscientist. It was published on Frontiers of Physics in November 2020. I encourage you to have a look at that. The results are uncanny. And again, it is not the only line of research that leads to similar conclusions. There is also a very recent paper, The Autodidactic Universe, which was published on the Archive in April, beginning of April 2021. So at the time I'm recording this video, just a little over a month ago, written by Stephen Alexander, a well-respected physicist. Lee Smolin, a very well-known physicist, is co-author. And what they have realized is the following. The mathematical structure of the fundamental laws of physics is compatible with the mathematical structure of how a neuronal network performs computations and learns. In other words, the laws of physics may actually be the expression of a learning process in an underlying and immanent neuronal network that is immanent across the entire physical universe. It is the expression of that neuronal network, of that learning process that we perceive and call the laws of physics. So the regularities we call the laws of physics are expressions of an underlying learning process of a neural network. Now, what is it that learns? When we talk about learning, what are we referring to? Usually we are referring to a mind. A mind learns. So you could say that this paper is providing at least some indication that underlying and immanent in the entire physical universe there is a mind that is learning, and the laws of physics, the regularities we call the laws of physics, are an expression of this learning process, because the mathematical structure of the laws of physics matches the mathematical structure of a neuronal network in the process of learning. Stephen Alexander is actually publishing a new book this year, which I have had the pleasure to see a review copy of. And there is a chapter in that book in which he very explicitly addresses this question: is there a universal mind underlying physical reality and immanent in physical reality? So when that book comes out, I highly recommend you to have a look at that. Now, their approach in this paper is completely distinct from the approach of these guys in that other paper, but both seem to lead to the conclusion that what we call the physical universe is actually the extrinsic appearance of mental activity, learning mental activity. All right, now, I want to bring all of this together, and to do that, I'm going to tell you a story. And each step in this story may sound arbitrary to you or not very convincing at the time I'm telling you about this step. So I ask you to not be too critical yet. Let's finish the story, and then we can critically investigate whether it's really the best story, whether we really have reasons to take it seriously. It's very difficult to make this story clear to you step by step in a way that I can totally defend each step in and of itself. It would become too technical. I did that in the literature. I did that in my second PhD thesis. But for this course, I wanted to be more accessible to non-specialists. So it's a much easier way to understand the story if I tell you the way I'm going to tell it now. So just hold back a little bit on your critical tendencies. Everything will be justified later. The story goes as follows. Once upon a time, everything that there was in the whole of existence was one universal mind, which I'm representing here as a circle, a very traditional symbol of eternity and infinity. So there was this one sphere of mentation, this one field, integrated field of mentation. And of course, by definition, there was no outside world, because this mind is all that exists. There is nothing outside it. Therefore, whatever experiences this mind could have, they would have to be endogenous experiences. In other words, experiences that don't depend on perception, don't depend on what's technically called intentional content. They don't depend on things that are outside the mind. In our case, perceptual experiences would be vision, tasting, touch, and endogenous experiences would be things like imagination, ideas, emotions, thoughts, things that arise within us, even if we were to be locked up in an ideal sensory deprivation chamber. You can have imagination, you can have thoughts, you can have emotions and ideas, even if your eyes are closed and your ears are plugged. So this one mind, which was all there is, according to this story, had endogenous experiences akin to what we call ideas and emotions. Now, I'm not saying that the ideas and emotions of this mind are comparable to our own ideas and emotions. That would be anthropomorphizing the metaphor too much. The only reason I'm using the words ideas and emotions here is to appeal to the endogenous character of those experiences. In other words, the experiences of this one universal mind are akin in some way to our ideas and emotions, but not identical to them, because this universal mind is not a human being. All right. This is how it started. Now, the second step in this storyline is that this one consciousness, this one mind, and I'm using the words consciousness and mind interchangeably in the sense of phenomenal consciousness. This one mind then underwent dissociation, which is a well-known psychiatric phenomenon, and an alter, what's technically called an alter personality, an alternative personality, formed within it through dissociation, with its own dissociated endogenous experiences, ideas, and emotions. Now, what is dissociation? In the past, it used to be called, extreme forms of dissociation used to be called multiple personality disorder. And that's when different segments of what is fundamentally one and the same mind seemingly break apart, such that one segment has some of the memories, another alter has other memories, and they don't access each other's memories. Some of the alters inherit some personality traits, other alters inherit other, maybe repressed personality states that the person wouldn't give expression to without dissociation. So the different properties and contents of what was originally one mind seem to sort of divide themselves across different centers of awareness, different centers of consciousness, which are seemingly separate from one another in the sense that they cannot inferentially access each other's contents and cannot access each other's memories. Now, this is a well-known phenomenon. It's known to exist. I'm not proposing anything new here. I'm taking this idea, this empirical idea of dissociation, and I'm transporting it to a cosmic level, as opposed to a merely human level. I'm saying, okay, this one mind underwent dissociation, and an alter was formed because of that. Now, dissociation entails a dissociative boundary, the limit of the dissociated ideas and emotions. So from within the boundary, ideas and emotions from the outside cannot go in, and the other way around is also not possible. You cannot have this commerce, this traffic of mental contents across a dissociative boundary. Memories, imaginations, character traits, whatever. That's the point of dissociation, is that a boundary is formed that limits the commerce, the exchanges of influence across different mental contents. That's what dissociation is. However, the mental contents outside the dissociation have their own dynamics. They are oscillating, they are being excited, they are experiences. And these experiences can impinge on the dissociative boundary from the outside. Now, this idea of impingement is an important one. So let me try to elaborate a little bit on this slowly. Imagine that you're having relationship problems at home with your husband or wife, boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever. And that is stressing you. That's making you feel bad. And it's really impairing your ability to function. It's debilitating. But the morning comes and you need to go to work. So what do you do in order to be able to work? You compartmentalize. You take your relationship problems, all the bad emotions associated with it, and you put it in a drawer, so to say. You park them. We use these words colloquially. You need to compartmentalize, you need to park it, you need to find a place for it and set it aside. And then you go to work, having set those emotions aside, so that you can function. So we can say that that is a form of deliberate dissociation. Your mind as a whole didn't stop feeling those emotions. They are there. They're right there in the background. But they become dissociated from your executive ego, the part of your mind that performs functions, that does work. So you deliberately created a dissociation, a light dissociation within your own mind. Your emotions are still felt, but they are set aside, and your executive ego, which is still part of your mind, can work properly because it's dissociated from those emotions, which are still being felt by you, but not by your executive ego, because they are dissociated from one another. Now, although those emotions are parked and are dissociated from the executive ego, they still indirectly influence the ego. They impinge on the ego. How? Well, I think we all can relate to that. Even if you parked your negative emotions, they will modulate your mood. You may be bad-mooded at work. You may be easy to irritate. Things that your colleagues do may irritate you, which otherwise it wouldn't irritate you. You may become more pessimistic. You may have a darker outlook to the events of the day, what might happen, what might not happen. You may become more silent. Your behavior will change. The way you comport yourself will change. And all this will happen although the executive ego is not feeling those emotions. The emotions are still dissociated, but from across the dissociative boundary, they impinge on the boundary of the executive ego, and they modulate what's happening inside. They don't get across, that doesn't happen, because there is dissociation, but by impinging on the boundary, say the boundary flexes as it's being impinged on, this modulates your internal states, the states of the executive ego. I trust that we can all relate to that. We can all relate to our ability to park negative things and not feel them directly, but still have our conscious inner life indirectly influenced by those dissociated emotions. This is what I call impingement across a dissociative boundary. So, the ideas and emotions, the transpersonal mental states in the mind at large, in other words, whatever is going on in that universal consciousness outside the altar that has just formed. So these ideas and emotions impinge on the dissociative boundary, just like your parked negative relationship problems impinge on your executive ego at work. And then nature has developed a way to leverage this impingement. You see, in this analogy, we are altars of universal consciousness. We are dissociated altars of universal consciousness. That's why we think we are separate individual minds. That's why we don't think that we are the whole universe. We are dissociated. And evolution, sorry about that, it's not time for that yet. Evolution has found a way, to leverage this impingement. Why? Because this impingement conveys information about what's going on outside the altar to the altar through the dissociative boundary. And for us to survive, we need to know something about what's going on in the world so we can steer our actions accordingly. So evolution has found a way to leverage this impingement, and the result is what we call the screen of perception. Evolution has found a way to zero in on that subtle impingement and amplify it and display it to us at a glance on the screen of perception. And what way is that? That's the dashboard that we talked about in part 1. The dashboard, that instrument panel full of dials that contain information about the world, those dials are fed by this impingement. You see? So if you have a pitot tube in an aircraft which collects information about speed, that's the impingement. It's the air outside impinging on the pitot tube. And then there will be a dial somewhere inside indicating airspeed. That dial will be fed by this impingement here, just like the dial in the airplane is fed by information coming from the pitot tube, which is impinged on by the air outside. So the physical world is this screen of perception, which translates the impingement of mental contents on our mental dissociative boundary into this at-a-glance view that we call the world, the physical world. The physical world exists only here, on the dissociative boundary. That's where the instrument panel is. And those instruments are fed information through this process of impingement. What's really going on outside are just endogenous mental states. Nothing physical. There's no space, time, or objects, nothing like that. What's really going on outside are these ideas and emotions that impinge on our equally mental dissociative boundary. But evolution has found a way to translate that into this at-a-glance instrument panel that gives us information about what's going on outside ourselves, so we stand a better chance to survive. And that's what we call the physical world. It's the instrument panel here that is fed by this impingement process. And the result of that is we see the world. We see the clouds, we see the sky, we see a fence, and we see plants and the rest of the world. This is the instrument panel. It's what appears on the instrument panel, on the dashboard of dials. What's really going on is this. But of course, we only have access to the dashboard, because otherwise there would be no upper limit to the dispersion of our inner perceptual states, and we would dissolve into an entropic soup. That's one. And two, evolution would swiftly drive us to extinction, because it's not useful to have, it's not conducive to survival to have a transparent window into the world. That would be too confusing. We need a sort of virtual reality user interface, and that's what the dashboard of dials is. Hopefully, I've brought a lot of things together in this slide. Okay, now let's take the next step. I'm talking about these two sides of experience, the intrinsic one, what we experience within the alters that we are. As I said, we are alters of a universal mind. And the extrinsic appearance, which is how this stuff here presents itself to us on the screen of perception. That's the origin of these two perspectives to experience, the intrinsic view and the extrinsic appearance as perceived from across a dissociative boundary. Now, is this a revolutionary new way of understanding experience and the nature of reality? Of course not. It's as old as it gets. There's nothing older in philosophy. And to make that point, I constructed this little table here. So, look, we can divide the world into essence, what it is in and of itself, its ontological category, its ontological basis, and appearance, which is how the world presents itself to observation. Not what it is in and of itself, but how it presents itself to observation. Now, yours truly, me, calls essence the intrinsic view. You have heard me saying this multiple times today. And the appearance I call simply extrinsic appearance. So the intrinsic view is direct experience. Extrinsic appearance is how inner experience presents itself to observation from across a dissociative boundary. That's my terminology. My colleague, philosopher Itay Shani, prefers the terms concealed nature and revealed nature. But he means essentially the same, essence and appearance. That's what he's talking about, but using different terms. Federico Fagin, the inventor of the microprocessor, who has done a lot of great work in philosophy of mind and foundations of physics, uses other words. He calls essence nosim, for nose and symbol. And appearance he simply calls the classical world, which arises from observation, because appearance is by definition how the world presents itself to observation. Since the classical world is the result of a quantum observation, a quantum measurement, appearance is the classical world. And essence is what is described by the mathematics of coherent quantum systems. That's his view. So he is linking quantum systems in a superposition, pure quantum states. He's saying that's how we describe essence. And once you look and the system decoheres or collapses, whatever you want to call it, the result is the classical world. And that classical world is simply the appearance of the essence described by coherent quantum systems, which he calls nosim. So he means the same thing. 20th century philosopher Owen Barfield called essence the unrepresented, and appearance he called, appearances. He even has a book titled Saving Appearances, or Saving the Appearances. He meant the same thing. French scholar, also 20th century, Henri Corbin, essence he associated with imagination, which is completely understandable because remember, if you go back to this slide here, essence is this. And these are endogenous experiences, not perceptual ones. And what is imagination? Imagination is the richest endogenous experience. We can trigger nearly every experience through imagination. We can trigger fear, desire, disgust, regret, hope, imagery, sound, everything. So he uses the word imagination, which is an appeal to the fact that essence is basically endogenous experiences. There is no world outside experience. Essence is endogenous experience. And for appearance, he uses the words icons or symbols. Cheatham wrote a book about Corbin's philosophy, and he named the book All the World an Icon. And that's an allusion to the idea of Corbin's that all material objects are but symbols, icons. They are not their own meaning. They are pointing at something else. They are pointing at the immanent essence that lies behind and immanent in the physical world. So the physical world is just symbols. symbols pointing at their own inner essence. And their inner essence is imagination, the imagination of a universal mind. Now, look how appropriate it is. I call it extrinsic appearance, but this is the dashboard of instruments of part 1. That's the dashboard there. And aren't the instruments, the dials on the dashboard, symbols? Of course they are, because if you have a dial and there is a needle there saying air pressure is X, that's pointing at the real thing. And the real thing in the metaphor is the actual air pressure. Air pressure doesn't look like a dial. The dial is a symbol that points at the actual air pressure outside in the metaphor. Now, forget the metaphor now. What Corban is saying is that objects in the physical world, objects and events, are indeed like dials in that they are pointing to the underlying immanent essence of the world, which is of an imaginative character, endogenous experiential states. Going now to the 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer, he called essence the will. Why? Because the will is the archetypal example of an endogenous experiential state. Even if you're locked in a sensory deprivation chamber, you still have wants and you still have fears. In other words, the will. So the essence of the world for him are these endogenous experiential states, which he called the will. And there is another handy motivation for using the word will. Schopenhauer realized that the universe is dynamic. It is changing, it's evolving, it's going somewhere. Things happen in nature. And he surmised that there had to be an impetus for that change. That in essence, the universe had to have an experiential drive towards changing itself, reconfiguring itself. And what is that impetus? What's that drive? Well, it's the will. The universe needs to want something in order to go somewhere and do something. If the universe were perfectly content and had no will, it would be static. That's Schopenhauer's reasoning, I believe. So he used the word will, totally understandable and totally compatible with everything I'm telling you today. And the appearances, or the classical world, what comes out of a quantum system upon measurement or observation, he called representations, which is similar to symbols in meaning. Representations point at their inner essence. They point at the will which is immanent in them. So the physical world is a representation in the same sense that the dashboard of dials in an airplane is a representation of the reality of the world outside, the reality of the storm, the air, the rain outside. The dashboard of dials is a representation of the world as it is in itself. It doesn't look at all like the world as it is in itself, but it represents it according to the paradigm of the dashboard of dials. So the representations represent the real world outside, which is will. In other words, which is endogenous experiential states. It's not physical. Physicality is just here in the representations, in the instrument panel. You see, everybody's saying the same thing. Immanuel Kant, late in the 18th century now, he called essence, the world as it is in itself, the noumena. And the world as it appears to our observation, he called phenomena, which is the origin of the term phenomenal consciousness, which takes this notion that phenomena are experiences, are what we experience. It's not the world as it is in itself, but how the world is experienced. So phenomenal consciousness comes from Kant's choice of word here. If we go even earlier in the 18th century, we get to Emanuel Swedenborg, who called essence, the essence of reality, the real reality, he called the spirit world. You know, back in the day, science and religion were still in the process of divorce, but they were not quite separated yet. So he called it the spirit world. And the appearances, or the physical world, or what Swedenborg called the natural world, is made up of correspondences. He called them correspondences. So instead of representations, instead of symbols, he called them correspondences. Why? Because they correspond to the dynamics of the world as it is in itself, to the dynamics of the spirit world. They represent the spirit world. You know, there is a correspondence between the dials on the dashboard and what's happening in the world outside. So Swedenborg chose the word correspondences. So for Swedenborg, every object, every phenomenon of the natural world corresponds to some dynamics, to something, to some reality in the spirit world, which is immanent in the natural world. Again, saying the same thing. Now, if you go even earlier, let's go now to the 17th century, to the figure of Baruch de Espinosa. It's a figure very close to my heart. He was a Dutchman with an Iberian background, sort of like me. I mean, forget that I am half Danish. My other half is Portuguese. So I'm a Dutchman with an Iberian background as well. Well, never mind. This is my own motivation for feeling close to Spinoza. But Spinoza called the essence of the world natura naturans, nature begetting, nature doing something. He also called it substance, that which stands underneath, substance, that which stands under. In other words, the immanent reality behind the world, or nature begetting, nature doing something. And the word substance he used, he took this word from scholastic philosophy. And the scholastics used the word substance as a translation, a Latin translation, substantia, a Latin translation for ousia, which is the original Greek word. Now, ousia is a very unambiguous term. It means something that has a standalone reality, something that exists in and of itself. It's not a representation. It's not an epiphenomenon. It's not reducible. An ousia is something that has standalone reality in and of itself. It's an existent. It's an ontological category. So for Spinoza, the essence of the world, it's ousia, the thing that really has standalone reality, he called substance, or natura naturans. And the manifestation of that essence in the form of appearances, he called natura naturata, nature begotten, nature manifest. Or modes, he used the word modes, well, the Latin equivalent, meaning modes of expression of nature as it is in itself. Nature as it is in itself is natura naturans. When natura naturans expresses itself in a certain mode, what you get is, well, modes. And these modes are the correspondences. They are the phenomena. They are representations of natura naturans. They are symbols and icons that point at natura naturans. They are the appearance of natura naturans. And what those appearances are, they are the classical physical world, the world of solid objects spread across space and time, the revealed face of nature, the extrinsic appearance of nature. You see? It all comes together through the history of philosophy. But now I want to make a point that has personal significance for me. So apologies for the mild digression, but there is an incredibly widespread misunderstanding and misrepresentation of Spinoza. Lots of scientists today who try to be sympathetic to philosophy but do not understand philosophy at all, they make this stupid claim that for Spinoza, God was the natural world. In other words, the classical world, the appearances, the symbols, the representations, the phenomena, natura naturata, the modes. No, that's not what Spinoza said. Spinoza didn't equate God with solid matter around us as presented on a screen of perception. He equated God with natura naturans, with the underlying ousia, with that which stands behind, that which stands underneath, the substance. That's what God was for him, the thing that has a reality in and of itself, an ousia, a divine substance that exists whether it's observed or not. And the mode of manifestation of God, the nature begotten, natura naturata, that is the material world. But the material world isn't God. The material world is an image, an appearance of what God is doing. Natura naturans, nature begetting. You see the critical difference here. People who say that the implicit metaphysics of science is Spinoza's metaphysics, well, if they are right, then that excludes materialist scientists, because Spinoza's metaphysics was not materialist at all. He did not equate God with material nature. He equated God with that which underlies and is immanent in material nature. But material nature, natura naturata, has no standalone existence. It's not the thing in itself. It's just the dials on the dashboard. It's pointing at something else. Natura naturans, substance, ousia. And that is what God was. So nature at best is an appearance, an image of God. But even if nature were not there, because God is not being observed, God would still exist. Now, don't take my word for this. Take Spinoza's word, because he wrote a letter at the end of his life to his best friend in which he clarified precisely this point, because people already in his time were misunderstanding him. He was considered a dreadful atheist. And this misunderstanding arose from this notion that for him, God was simply the material world, which equates God to nothing. Because, we don't need to equate God to the material world. It's just the material world. You're not adding anything by calling it God. So people thought Spinoza is an atheist, and he was actually excommunicated from the Jewish faith and suffered his whole life because of this misunderstanding. So he wrote in a letter that people who think that he's equating God with material nature just didn't get him. He meant no such thing at all. He wrote this. So I urge you, read Spinoza's letters if you think I am lying or I am misunderstanding him. Go and read his letter in which he talks exactly about that, even prior to the publication of the Ethics. The Ethics were published posthumously, but in his previous work on politics and all that, he already hinted at his metaphysics, and he was already misunderstood in his lifetime. Now, despite his letter, he is still vastly misunderstood today, which is tragic. Shame on Western thinking. For this, to deface one of its greatest exponents so miserably, so tragically. But anyway, let's continue. Now, as I suggested, as I said, we are alters of a spatially extended, unbound, universal field of subjectivity, a universal consciousness or a universal mind, if you will. But we sort of identify with our bodies. So if we are just dissociated psychic or mental processes, what is the relationship between those mental processes and the body? Because they seem to go hand in hand. Here's the link. Suppose there are two alters. You are alter 1, and a friend of yours is alter 2, both within universal consciousness. Now, you see your friend's body. You sort of link the idea of your friend not only to your friend's mental inner life, but also to his or her body. So how is that you see a body that corresponds to your friend? Well, as we've seen, mental activity across the dissociative boundary can impinge on it, which evolution has leveraged in order to create the screen of perception, our internal dashboard of dials. But of course, the other way around also happens. Dissociated mental activity within the alter also impinges from the inside on the dissociative boundary. And this impingement leads to a change in the states of the transpersonal mental activity in universal consciousness, or mind at large, that sea of mentation that surrounds all alters. And this activity then, modulated by alter 2, in turn impinges on alter 1. Oops, sorry, I went too far. Impinges on alter 1. And what does alter 1 then see? Alter 1 sees a body. So a body is the extrinsic appearance of the dissociated mental states of alter 2 as perceived across one or more dissociative boundaries through this chain of impingement. States here impinge on the dissociative boundary from the inside out. Those, in turn, impinge on the states of the world, which impinge on the dissociative boundary of you, of alter 1. And the result of that is that on your dashboard of dials, on the screen of your perception, you see a body. And that body, of course, corresponds to alter 2 because it is the imprint of alter 2 on the common environment that alters 1 and 2 share. In other words, it's the imprint of the inner states of alter 2 on the transpersonal states of the environment that surrounds alters 1 and 2, the common world in which alters 1 and 2 are immersed. Through this chain of impingements, alter 1 gets to see a body that is the extrinsic appearance of alter 2. Therefore, my point, life, living organisms, they are merely the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in universal consciousness, a process akin to dissociative identity disorder. They are the appearance on our internal dashboard of dials of a mental phenomenon outside our dissociative boundary. That's what life is. Life is the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in universal consciousness. All right. Can I substantiate this a little bit better? Do we know that dissociative processes look like anything? Do we have evidence for that? Well, we do. Of course, dissociative processes feel like something from the inside. The question is, do they look like something from the outside? And they do. Jolanda Schlumpf, here in the Netherlands in 2014, did this amazing research with 2 groups of people. One group was patients diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder. And the other group were actors paid to pretend to themselves that they were dissociated as well. Actors paid to pretend to be dissociated, not to the researchers, but to themselves. And they put both groups under a functional brain scanner to measure the patterns of their brain activity. And the question was, can we differentiate the patients with actual DID from actors pretending to be dissociated, pretending to themselves to be dissociated? And the result was they very well could, because true dissociative processes had a unique appearance. They looked like something identifiable in a functional brain scanner. You could tell that this person is a DID patient because dissociation does have an extrinsic appearance. It does look like something identifiable when observed from the outside, from an extrinsic perspective. Now, as we talked about before, the universe at its largest scales is, in a certain sense, akin to a brain, akin to the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. So, if within a human brain dissociative processes look like something, do dissociative processes in the universe look like something? Well, I submit to you that they do. And what they look like is living organisms, metabolizing organisms. Metabolism is what dissociation at the level of universal consciousness looks like when observed. Except that in the case of the universe, we don't need a brain scanner to look at it. We are inside the brain already. We don't need to look through a skull. We are inside. We just need to look around. If you see a cat, if you see a bird, a tree, those are the diagnostic images of dissociative processes in the universal mind. So that's what I offer to you. This is what life is. What we call life, what we call metabolism, is the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process. And the end of life, death, is the end of that dissociative process. All right. Now, since I'm always leveraging this idea of dissociation, we need to figure out whether this idea, this phenomenon called dissociation, is strong enough to lead to this very compelling impression that we are separate from the rest of the world. Dissociation needs to be sort of blinding because, you see, if I am part of a universal mind, how come I can't read your thoughts? I don't know what's happening in China right now. I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. Why not? I am part of the one universal mind. I should know all that. If dissociation suffices to blind me to all that's going on beyond my local environment, accessible to my perceptual organs, then dissociation has to be really strong. It has to be literally blinding. Is it so? That's what I want to show you this little film for. It's a film produced by Voyeur. motivated by a paper published in a very well-respected journal in 2018, and they picked up on that and they made a video. So let's have a look at that video first, and then I will elaborate a little more.
But Kastrup looked into dissociative identity disorder, or DID, which is when someone has multiple subjective consciousnesses in their brain. The study says that one woman had a separate personality she called Alter that she claimed was blind. And when her brain was scanned with her Alter in control, the portions of the brain associated with sight were turned off.
All right, as you saw, the video is not quite accurate. They attribute this research to me, and now I just referred to that research. I didn't do it. And they say that the name of the Alter is Alter. No. Alter is just the technical name we give to a dissociated personality. But, okay, overlook all that. The video is referring to this study here. I'm giving you the first page of the journal, Sight and Blindness in the Same Person, Gating in the Visual System. It's a 2015 paper written by two German psychiatrists or neuroscientists. It's quite amazing what they did. So they had this woman with multiple alters, and what was unique about her is that some of the alters claimed to be blind, even though she had no organic problem. Her eyes were perfectly functioning. The host personality could see perfectly. The other alters could see perfectly. So they had this brilliant idea of hooking her up to an EEG cap and monitor her brain activity as the alters exchanged control, executive control. And lo and behold, when an alter that claimed to be blind had executive control, activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain disappeared, even though the woman's eyes were open and stuff was happening in front of her. That's not something you can fake. That's literal blindness, even though nothing is wrong with your eyes, with your optical nerve, nothing. Organically, nothing's wrong with you. It's a purely mental process, but strong enough to literally blind you. And when a sighted alter or the host personality would reassume executive control, normal brain activity in the visual cortex would return. Now, this shows you that dissociation is literally blinding. If it can do this, if it can blind you, even though your eyes are open and everything organically is right with you, then I think it's entirely reasonable and plausible to expect it to blind me to your thoughts, or to what's happening in China, or to what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. Dissociation is strong enough to put a wall within one and the same mind and preempt a traffic of mental contents across that wall, across that dissociative boundary. So it's difficult to find better evidence for how strong dissociation can be than this. I think this goes all the way. All right. Now, another criticism that I sometimes get is people who claim that the analogy with DID is not suitable. It doesn't do everything I claim that it does. For instance, people with dissociative identity disorder, their alters can't shake hands with each other. But if I am an alter of universal consciousness and you are another one, I can shake hands with you. So this dissociation in universal consciousness is not quite analogous to DID, because we can see each other as alters, but the alters of a person with DID, the alters within the human mind of a patient of DID, presumably, so the argument goes, cannot see each other, cannot talk to each other, cannot hear each other, cannot shake hands. Is that true? No, it is not true. The fallacy of the criticism is that it's comparing apples to bananas. Remember, at the level of the universal mind, there is no outside world. The universal mind is all there is. By definition, it's the entire universe. So there is no outside world. So when different alters of the universal mind interact with one another, perceive one another, that interaction is taking place within the universal mind. So if you want to make a proper comparison, apples to apples, then you have to ask whether the alters of a person with DID can see each other within the mind of the person with DID and not in the physical world, because there is no outside world for universal consciousness. So you cannot compare these two things. It would be comparing apples to bananas. So the question is, in the visions and dreams of a patient with DID, do different alters interact with one another within the context of that human mind? For the analogy to hold, then I would acknowledge they would have to interact with one another, because that would be comparable to my interacting with you in the physical world, which is within the universal mind. Do you see the point? So we have to look at the visions and dreams of patients with DID. Now, not many patients with DID have concomitant schizophrenia, so they don't have realistic visions. So let's restrict ourselves to dreams. Let's look at the literature. Dreams in dissociative disorders. Actually, there is a paper. There's many, but I selected this one because it's the most relevant one, and also because it's a paper from Harvard Medical School, which is difficult to dismiss. Now, it's a relatively old paper from '94, but this is clinical research. It does not depend on brand new technologies, so the conclusions hold. It's as good as if it had been published last year. Now, they studied a variety of patients with a variety of dissociative disorders. DID is only the strongest form of dissociation. There are less strong forms of dissociation. Now, they observed that for patients with multiple personality disorder, DID, that's the old name for DID, many other phenomena occurred, including alters appearing as dream characters. There you go. Do different alters participate in the same dream and interact with each other in the same dream? Yes, they do. And this is what this paper discusses. I selected one passage that's particularly relevant because of the number of alters involved, but there are many other passages in this paper. I recommend that you go and download it and have a read the literature that is associated with this paper as well, later literature which cite this paper, or papers cited by this paper. And you get a view of the state of play in that field of study. But let me read this passage. It's the dream of a person, Sarah, with dissociative personality disorder and multiple alters. And the alters had different names, like Annie, Anne, Yo, and so on. Here's the passage. I will read it together with you. The host personality, Sarah, remembered only that her dream from the previous night involved hearing a girl screaming for help. Alter Annie, age 4, remembered a nightmare of being tied down naked and unable to cry out as a man began to cut her vagina. Anne, age 9, another alter, dreamed of watching this scene and screaming desperately for help. Apparently, the voice in the host's dream. Remember, Sarah remembered the dream in which she heard a girl screaming. Teenage Yo, yet another alter, or Joe, dreamed of coming upon the scene and clubbing the little girl's attacker over the head. In her dream, Joe's dream, he fell to the ground dead and she left. In the dreams of Anne and Annie, the teenager with the club appeared, struck the man to the ground, but he arose and renewed his attack again. 4-year-old Sally dreamed of playing with her dolls happily and nothing else. Both Annie and Anne reported the little girl playing obliviously in the corner of the room in their dreams. Although there was no definite abuser-identified alter manifesting at this time, the presence at times of a hallucinated voice similar to Sarah's uncle suggested there might be yet another alter experiencing the dream from the attacker's vantage. So you see, the multiple alters of Sarah partook in the same dream from their own perspective and interacted with one another. They could see and hear one another. They could club one another over the head. This is entirely analogous to what I propose is happening right now. We are alters of universal consciousness partaking in this dream we call the world. And we see and interact and hear one another and club one another over the head as well at times. That's my reply to this criticism. The analogy is suitable if you compare apples to apples. You cannot compare apples to bananas. You have to be consequent in the way you lay out your criticism. Anyway, next step. So the conclusion is the following. Unlike mainstream physicalism, which requires postulating a non-given, postulating a completely abstract theoretical entity called matter, which is exhaustively defined in terms of quantities alone and has no intrinsic qualities. Instead of postulating this extra, we can make sense of the whole of reality by taking only what's given as ontically real. And what is nature's given? Nature's given is experience. It's all we have when we are 5 years old. Everything else is theory, like André Linde said in the opening quote of this module. Everything else is theory. We start from experience, and ultimately that's all we have. Whatever is non-experiential is an abstraction of mind, of experience. So analytic idealism doesn't postulate anything other than experience. The only thing it postulates is experience goes beyond the limits of our personal minds. It's like saying that the earth continues beyond the visible horizon, which is eminently reasonable. All we have is experience, and now I assume that you also have experiences, and there are transpersonal experiences in nature, but experiences of the same kind, in the sense that this stuff is also experiential. It's an extrapolation of what I know to exist, because I have direct access to it. Beyond the horizon, the earth continues on, and it's of the same kind that we can see until the horizon. In other words, until my horizon, the horizon of my personal mind, all I have is experience. So I will postulate that beyond the horizon there is more experience, which is not my, as an individual mind, a dissociated outer, but it's still experiential. Mainstream physicalism, on the other hand, says until the horizon it's experience, but beyond the horizon it's something totally different. It's not experiential at all. It's matter. Well, I don't think that that's the best alternative on the table. So how do we explain everything in terms of experience? Oh, the inanimate world that we see when we look up to the night sky, the stars of our galaxy, the nebulae, and so on. These are the extrinsic appearance of transpersonal mental processes as they are displayed on the screen of perception of the altar, on the dashboard of dials of the altar. These are our dials, indicating to us, providing information to us about underlying experiential states that are substanding, that are the substance of reality, standing behind appearances. They are the ousia of the universe, which presents itself to us in the form of what in the dashboard of dials appears as the night sky. And the body, we are just dissociated alters of this universal mind. Now notice that all of these are experiences. The substance of the world are transpersonal experiential states to which we as alters have no direct access, but they are experiential. What do we have access to? To the dashboard. And what's the dashboard? Perceptual experiences. They are experiences as well, inside and outside, intrinsic and extrinsic. These are all experiences, multiple perspectives of experience, but all experiential. So we can account for the whole of reality with mind alone, with experience alone. Moreover, with one mind, which avoids all kinds of complicated philosophical problems if we were to postulate fundamentally different minds. All we need is to leverage a natural process that we know to exist, namely dissociation. We know it to exist beyond doubt since the advent of neuroimaging. Not only that, we know that it does exactly what we need it to do in order to explain reality according to it. We know that it's literally blinding. We know that it alters of one mind can interact with one another in the context of that mind. So we know that dissociation does exactly what we need it to do in order to explain the whole of reality only with nature's given experience. Therefore, the experiencer, one experiencer, because experiences are just patterns of excitation of this one universal experiencer, which is you, which is me, which is my cat, the amoeba in my toilet, and the trees outside. It is everything. But we are dissociated, so we do not recognize that identity in the same way that Anne and Annie did not recognize their identities with the girl playing on the corner of the room in the dream that we just discussed. Now let's go back to how we started. We started with 3 empirical observations, not the simplest theoretical interpretations, but 3 empirical observations that were undeniable. Number 1, brain function correlates with inner experience. How does analytic idealism account for that? Well, we just said that a body, which includes the brain and the brain's activity, is what the dissociated mental activity of an author looks like when observed across one or more dissociative boundaries. Therefore, brain activity is part of what inner mental activity looks like when observed from across the respective dissociative boundary. And then, of course, it correlates. The image of a phenomenon correlates with the phenomenon it is an image of. Of course. No, your image in the mirror correlates with you because it's an image of the phenomenon you call you. So, of course, brain function correlates with inner experience because brain function is what inner experience looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. I will repeat because this is very important. Brain function correlates with inner experience because brain function is what inner experience looks like when observed from across its dissociative boundary. It's not because brain function generates experience. No, that's the mistake of physicalism that goes nowhere, that can be reduced to absurdity. We have to understand the correlation as the correlation between the image of a phenomenon and the phenomenon, not the correlation between a cause of the phenomenon and the phenomenon. You see? Second observation, we all seem to share the same world. Do we, under analytic idealism? Of course we do. We share this ocean of transpersonal endogenous mental states, which are akin to thoughts and emotions, although not human thoughts and emotions. More like simple, instinctive thoughts and emotions, with a broad variety, but not with higher level mental functions. We are immersed in this ocean of, quote, thoughts and emotions, which impinge on our respective dissociative boundaries, leading to what we call perception. So outer N has its dashboard of dials here, its perceptual screen. Outer 2 has its dashboard. Outer 1 has its dashboard. And the dials in each of these dashboards are consistent with the dials on the other dashboards. Why? Because they are fed by the same thing. They are fed with information from the same surrounding and encompassing thoughts and emotions, transpersonal, endogenous experiential states that constitute the world as it is in itself. And that world presents itself to us on our dashboard of dials as what we call the physical world. But the physical world exists only here, on the dashboard. It is the dashboard. What's really going on outside, the noumena, the thing in itself, the nousim, the substance, the ousia of the world, that's endogenous transpersonal mental states or experiential states that impinge on our respective dissociative boundaries. So we do share the same world, a mental world of thoughts and emotions in which we are all immersed. And that world presents itself to us on the screen of our perception as what we call the physical or material world. Finally, the third observation, the laws of nature are independent of our desires. I can't change the world simply by wishing it to be different. Is that accounted for by analytic idealism? Of course it is. Your wishes are here. Wishes, if I can write it with a mouse. Here are our wishes. They are inside the dissociative boundary, and therefore they cannot affect directly what is outside. Remember, dissociation is literally blinding. If it can blind you, it can insulate your desires from having any effect in the world outside. It's certainly strong enough to do that. It's strong enough to completely separate you mentally, at least at an illusory level, not fundamentally, but it can create the experience, the full experience of being separated. And therefore, this separation works both ways. Your wishes, your fears, your desires do not have direct influence on what's going on beyond the dissociative boundary. The only way you can influence what's going on outside is by manipulating the dissociative boundary itself. Because on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials, what is this dissociative boundary? Well, it's the surface of our body. It's our skin, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our sense organs. Remember, the skin is a sense organ. We can feel anything that happens anywhere on the skin, and the skin surrounds our entire body. It's the image of the dissociative boundary, which is a mental thing in and of itself, on the dashboard of dials, on the screen of perception, which then has a physical form, a physical appearance. The physical appearance of the mental dissociative boundary is the surface of our body. By manipulating that surface, in other words, by moving our arms, moving our legs, we can perform work and change the world outside. But that doesn't happen through the dissociative boundary. It happens by means of the dissociative boundary. When you change the configuration of the dissociative boundary by moving your arms and legs, and then you can build houses, you can build computers, you can affect the world in a way that maintains or doesn't contradict the dissociation, because what you're moving is the boundary. You're not getting things directly across the boundary. All right, this is it. We've come to the end of this marathon. I hope it has been informative to you. In the next module, we are going to get into all the empirical evidence for analytic idealism, from foundations of physics and from neuroscience of consciousness, mainly. Now, a lot of people try to motivate a departure from mainstream physicalism based on so-called paranormal phenomena. Do I take these phenomena seriously? Yes, I do take certain paranormal phenomena seriously, because they have been investigated under very good protocols by very good researchers working in academia and the industry. So I do take them seriously, but I'm not going to use them to motivate analytic idealism and to motivate departing from mainstream physicalism, because I don't think we need to go that far. I think, solid, non-anecdotal data coming from scientific laboratories around the world is plenty. It's much more than enough to justify this move. So I am not going to get into paranormal stuff. I'm going to look at, hardcore neuroscience of consciousness, hardcore foundations of physics, including quantum physics, and see what this high quality, non-anecdotal, repeatable and repeated results inform us regarding ontology, regarding the nature of nature, what nature actually is in and of itself. That's all in part 5. I again recommend you don't jump straight to that. There was a lot of material we've covered today. Give yourself a couple of days to let it sink in. Try to see the world through these new lenses. Try to regard the physical world around you as a dashboard of dials on a plane that has no transparent window. And try to intuit what is behind that dashboard of dials, what those dials are measuring and telling you about indirectly. The ousia, the substance, that which stands underneath the panel of instruments, the dashboard of dials, the world as it is in itself, irrespective of how it presents itself to measurement or observation. Try to integrate that into your life such that it doesn't stay just conceptual, just a story in your mind, but it sinks into the rest of your body, the rest of your relationship with yourself, with others, and with nature. In other words, try to see the world through these new lenses, and I think you will find out that it's incredibly enriching. It gives reality a missing extra dimension of depth and meaning that has been lacking in Western culture since the Enlightenment project. It has been the biggest price we have paid for the many benefits of the Enlightenment project. And we are now in a position that we no longer need to pay this price, because reason and evidence can bring us to a place that restores this dimension of depth and meaning. It restores the reality of the world behind the physical, the world as it is in itself, beyond the instrument panel of the airplane, the actual clouds, lightning, storm, air, and winds outside, as opposed to just the dials. And then you can come back to part 5 and look together with me at all the scientific, rigorous, empirical evidence that supports analytic idealism and contradicts the other alternatives. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.